We've helped to innovate in the field of neurotechnology through a wide variety of different projects and have had contact points with over 11,000 people worldwide. Because we're such a large international network, the goal of these webinars is to give people from different countries and different disciplines the chance to learn about neurotechnology and related subjects. We'll be doing these webinars on different themes such as VR and EEG and others, as well as showcasing the amazing projects and research that our community does. This is our fourth webinar and it's still a work in progress. So if you do have any feedback, please let us know. With that in mind, there's a few points that we want you to know just before we get started here. Number one, for those that are in chat, please just be very respectful to others that are there. If you do decide to do anything trollish, you'll get a timeout. And number two, if you have any questions, please post them in chat. I'll be monitoring it, and I'll note down anything that anyone wants to ask. Final thing to know just before we get started here is that if you are interested in doing your own webinar, you could always email me at sydney@neurotechx.com, or you could also send me a message on the NeuroTechX Slack, which can be found on neurotechx.com. But with that, let's jump into our first to our webinar. For this month, we have Henry T. Greeley, who will be presenting NeuroEthics. If you haven't heard of Mr. Greeley before, he specializes in ethical and legal and social implications of new biomedical technologies, particularly those related to neuroscience, genetics, or stem cell research. He frequently serves as an advisor on California national and international policy issues. He is chair of California's Human Stem Cell Research Advisory Committee, a member of the Advisory Council of the NIH National Institute for General Medical Sciences, a member of the Committee on Sciences, Technology, and Law of the National Academies, a member of the Neuroscience Forum of the Institute of Medicine, and served from 2007 to 2010 as co-director of the Law and Neuroscience Project, funded by the MacArthur Foundation. Professor Greeley chairs the steering committee for the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics and directs both the Law School Center for Law and the Biosciences and the Stanford Program in Neuroscience and Society. In 2007, Professor Greeley was elected a fellow for the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. So thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Greeley.
Sure, my pleasure.
So if you just give me a quick second here, I'm gonna show your screen. So I'm just going to put you up here. I apologize, everyone. Unfortunately, we're having difficulty in getting his audio to connect to Hangout. So we had to do a quick workaround. And the best way we discovered to do that is to essentially connect him through Skype. So if you just give me a few seconds here, you'll get to see his face. So here we go.
Which may or may not be a good thing.
All right, so if I do a screen share here. Okay, so now if everything goes well, should be able to see him. Okay. Okay, let's see if everything is working. Okay. Can everyone in the chat hear us okay? Okay. May take a few seconds for them to respond, but I'm assuming everything is going to be okay. So I guess just to get us started here, Mr. Greeley, could you maybe just give us a quick introduction to the field of neuroethics and maybe tell us a little bit about the International Neuroethics Society?
Sure. Happy to do both those things. Although with that way too long introduction with a long list of things, none of which I actually get paid for. You left out actually the two that I think are most immediately relevant to this. I am currently in the middle of a 2-year term as president of the International Neuroethics Society, and I serve on the NIH's multi-council working group, which advises NIH on the NIH part of the BRAIN initiative. I co-chair the neuroethics work group of that working group. And so between NIH and the INS, the International Neuroethics Society, those are the two things I'm doing right now that are most involved in neuroethics. Whatever neuroethics is, and that's not a flip question. neuroethics is about 16 years old, most of us think, and a fair amount of that 16 years has involved people arguing over what neuroethics is and whether neuroethics actually is a thing. But for the purposes of, for my purposes and for the purposes of us, the International Neuroethics Society, neuroethics is really about the ethical, legal, and social issues. So it's not ethics defined narrowly, but ethics defined broadly, kind of the social intersection of advances in neuroscience. Ever since really, I think, fMRI began to be applied by humans, began to be applied to humans, the kinds of discoveries coming out of neuroscience have been full of potential wonders and potential terrors. Everything from lie detection and mind reading to brain control, to predicting psychopathy, to determining whether or not we have free will, all that and more has been at least raised as possibilities by neuroscience. All that stuff is really important to humans and to human societies because we are, to a large extent, our brains, or at least our minds. So I have a body, I like my body, I'm happy with my body, it's worked pretty well so far. But if Sydney and I were to change livers, I would still be me with Sydney's liver. If Sydney and I were to change brains, I think Sydney would have just gotten a much older and white-haired brain, a white-haired body. So we really are our minds and our brains, not entirely, but in a very fundamental way. Anything that affects our improved knowledge, anything that changes and improves our knowledge about how our brains work, how they generate our minds, how we can change our brains to affect our minds, all that is going to have a hugely powerful effect on how we live, on how we interact with people, on how we perceive ourselves. And that's what neuroethics is about. It's about trying to figure out, well, I think the main, to me, most important, the part I care most about, and I think what most people spend most of their time on in neuroethics, is how neuroscience is going to affect our cultures, our societies, our governments, ourselves. There are a couple of other things people do. Some people are really interested in the neuroscience of ethics and whether our brains process ethical questions differently from more mundane questions. And then there are a lot of important and interesting questions about research ethics. For example, when you round up the usual suspects, round up the usual subjects and put 20 college sophomores taking Psych 1 into a scanner, and you find something strange in the brains of 4 or 5 of them, what do? Do you tell them? Do you not tell them? If you tell them, what do you tell them? So there's some really interesting research ethics questions. There's some questions that some people find really interesting about the neuroscience of ethics. But I think the big questions really are, how will neuroscience, how will changes and advances in neuroscience affect how we live and who we are?
And I guess the International Neuroethics Society focuses on all these different questions?
Yeah, although what it focuses on is really what the members focus on. They've got over 300 members drawn from, I think, 6 continents, not Antarctica yet, although we're looking. And they cover a wide range of issues. We have neuroscientists, psychologists, neurosurgeons, neurologists, philosophers, lawyers, theologians, sociologists, anthropologists, and just lay people who are really interested in this stuff. So the society has a very broad tent. Anybody interested in neuroscience, defined fairly broadly to include, to some extent, things like cognitive psychology, and how it and the ethical, legal, and social issues it raises is very welcome in the society. Particularly welcome to come to our meetings. We have a big annual meeting every year, and we're sponsoring several other meetings in the course of the year. We also have, I think, a very useful newsletter that comes out on a regular basis to our members.
Fantastic. So I understand that you have a big interest at the intersection of law. When I was reading your bio and seeing some of the organizations that you were working with, and I apologize for missing the 2 most critical ones. My working memory is not good enough to remember all the different organizations you're a part of. But could you?
Neither is mine.
But maybe could you talk to us a little bit about where does maybe neuroscience and neurotechnology intersect with law?
Sure. I mean, it's natural for me because my day job is a law professor. I get paid to teach law students contracts, property, neuroethics, and genetics and law, and FDA law, and a variety of other things. The law is really deeply interested in brains because the law is really interested in minds. I mean, we're interested in bodies, but if you were to take a slug at me, take a swing at me and hit me in the face, it would make a real difference in terms of what the police and the court and the jury thought of you if you were doing it because you were mad at me, if you were doing it because you saw a scorpion on my cheek, if you were doing it because you had an epileptic seizure and you uncontrollably moved it. All those things make a difference. We care about what people are thinking and how. And so that's a prime way in which law is involved. But I really think there are at least 5 different ways in which the law cares a lot about what neuroscience can tell us. Prediction, mind reading, responsibility, treatment, and enhancement. The 1-floor elevator talk on each of those. Prediction is, if we could predict who's going to get Alzheimer's disease, what happens in terms of discrimination in employment, insurance, long-term care insurance, people's family relationships, people's self-image. If we could predict which 1% of 12-year-old boys is going to turn out to be a psychopath, what do we do with that? In mind reading, if we can tell whether somebody who's seeking lots of money or not so much money, but a disability stipend because they have intractable pain, many of those people have intractable pain, some of them don't. We don't have very good ways to tell. But pain is in the brain, and people are working on being able to see pain networks to help determine whether or not somebody is having the subjective sensation of pain. Other people are working on lie detection. Jack Gallant at Berkeley is doing amazing things working on decoding what people are thinking. Now, it's not quite as scary as it sounds because you've got to lie still in an MRI machine for an hour before you can figure out what you're thinking, but it's still disconcerting. The responsibility issues, a lot of philosophers don't seem to have the free will to not worry about free will. And they think that neuroscience, and some neuroscientists think that neuroscience will prove that we don't have any free will. And once that's proven, then the criminal justice system will dry up and blow away. I don't think that's true. I don't know any lawyers who think that's true, but it could have some effects, particularly in sentencing, on how we assign responsibility. Treatment, I mean, the whole point of a lot of the spending in neuroscience is to come up with new treatments, preventions, cures for neurological disease and mental illness. But if you learn enough about the brain to be able to treat some of those things, could you learn enough about the brain to be able to, quote, treat, close quote, shyness or religiousness or lack of religiousness or being a Democrat or being a Republican or being gay or being straight? That kind of, so I put scare quotes around the treatment that there. It's really treatment edging into mind control. Right. Then the last issue is enhancement. If we could take a pill that would suddenly make us a lot smarter, which we can't, by the way. Right now, there's nothing that's substantially better than caffeine. But if we could, what would we do with that? How would schools react to it? How would the bar exam and the medical exam react to it? If we could get people to be able to remember things better, would they be allowed to use it in court? Would they be required to use it in court? What are the fairness consequences if there are mental cognitive enhancements that are really expensive so only rich people can get them? All those ultimately become legal questions. So there's a lot of stuff that I can work on, and other lawyers, law professors, people interested in law who are interested in neuroscience can work on. The great important thing about the field so far, I think, is that we've managed to keep together the scientists, the clinicians, the social scientists, the lawyers. So if I'm thinking about writing something on predicting Alzheimer's disease, I collaborate with a neurologist or I collaborate with a neuroscientist so that the science is right, and I can make sure, for my part, that the law is right, and together we can argue things out, try to make sure that the overall policy recommendations we come out with are right.
Right. Now, I have a good follow-up question, and this comes from me doing a little bit about more research on some of the things you have done in the past. I know that you used to have a podcast with the CBS where you had at least the most recent one where you had a few speakers come on board to talk about things like TDCS or brain stimulation, consumer brain stimulation. So the question I have related to that are, number one, what are your thoughts related to the realm of consumer TDCS? The field of consumer TDCS has really changed in the past couple of years. Back then, it was something that was a very big hot topic, but as time has gone on and as the market has responded to it, for the most part, the market responded pretty negatively. And so most of the companies like Think and Focus are not doing very well. Think had to do some major pivots. Focus's website doesn't seem to be functioning very well at this point either. So I just want to know what your thoughts are on the subject, and have your thoughts changed over the years since that original podcast?
Well, definitely. I don't remember the specific podcast, but I do know that 7 or 8 years ago, I and a lot of people were very excited about TDCS. The first studies that got published showed not only statistically significant, but actually substantial changes in things. Sometimes the things were mood, sometimes the things were cognitive ability, sometimes the things were math ability, but sometimes the things were physical health issues. And the first studies were showing, lots and lots of success. People got excited about it. There was a big do-it-yourself movement. One of my graduate students wrote a long paper surveying and interviewing people involved in the do-it-yourself TDCS movement. But over the years, and this is not unique to this subject, this happens in a lot of bioscience things. The first studies are up here, and the next studies are down there, and the next studies are down there, and eventually maybe you're above water and maybe you're not. I still think TDCS has some potential. My guess is that what's happened is that its effects are more individualized than we expect, so that a particular montage, a particular layout of the electrodes, or a particular voltage or amperage may affect one person one way and other people in different ways or not at all. So as a result, if you do a study of 20 people, only 2 of them may respond. But if you changed around some of the parameters, maybe 2 other people would have responded. That's my guess about what's going on, but I think it's been a disappointment. I was really surprised when Think had to quasi-fold, really change its approach entirely. I used the Think device,
right,
both on the calming mode, vibe, I guess. They call them vibes, right?
Yeah.
On the energy mode and on the relax mode. The relax mode didn't do anything for me, but one of the 2 times I used it on the energy mode, I think it really did something to me. I thought they had a nice design. I thought it was going to work. It didn't. And in a way, maybe we need to go back to the starting point. We don't really know where that electricity goes in the brain and what it's stimulating and what it isn't. So maybe the applications got ahead of the basic research.
Right. And it's funny because I remember we did an event with the CEO of Think when we did our first event in Boston, and there was a lot of the same criticisms and thoughts of the people in the public that were in the crowd that night, and a lot of them were pushing against the science. But he was very adamant that it was working and it was succeeding. But I guess it's still one of those things that they're beyond I think the perception of doing brain stimulation and the fear that people may have. I still think that it didn't get the effect that most people wanted. Just because
it wasn't good enough.
Yeah, exactly.
For people to want to buy it, but that doesn't mean it'll always stay that way. We do know that we can use electrical stimulation to do amazing things to people's brains. We've been doing it for over 20 years for Parkinson's disease. People are doing deep brain stimulation for other things. You can use ECOG microelectrodes to elicit very interesting effects in the brains of people who you put these in. But the problem with the electrical stimulation that really works, and you can use it for brain-computer interfaces. You can get quadriplegics to move prosthetic arms. but you got to have implanted electrodes, and that's kind of a market limiting step. Not everybody wants electrodes implanted in their brains.
Right.
So I think a key step will be if and when somebody manages to get good, non-invasive, or at least less invasive neuromodulation, whether it's electrical or magnetic or ultrasound. If we can do that, then I think that market, both the research, the clinical uses, and the consumer market will take off.
Right.
Right now, we're not there.
So an extension of the question, I don't know if you saw this, but on Instructables about, I think a month ago or 2 months ago, someone had posted a DIY guide to build your own transcranial magnetic stimulation device. So for the people in the crowd that are not familiar with what it is, it's a more, I would say, extreme version of TDCS that actually causes action potentials to occur in the brain, used heavily in things like the treatment of depression. But as this technology potentially is the next one to become more accessible and potentially go to consumer market, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that it'll take the same path as TDCS? Do you think because of the potential danger associated with TMS, it'll be very different? What are your thoughts?
Hard to know. TMS is currently FDA approved for some applications, although only in the context of medical care. I think it really all depends on the risk-benefit ratio. I was a little surprised. FDA was very lenient with TDCS. They were very not unconcerned, but they were convinced that TDCS, in the form that the consumer companies were using it, was safe enough that they didn't worry about it. If you've got something that's more powerful, if you've got something that induces action potentials, I think FDA is likely to be more concerned, which means that they may well require proof of safety and efficacy before it can be marketed either to clinicians or either on prescription or for a direct-to-consumer basis. And if there are real safety issues, I think they should. I think safety is a really important ethical question. It's really unethical to sell people things that are unsafe and not effective. So it really will depend on what the safety parameters look like. It's so, there is just long been used for medical purposes, a non-invasive neurostimulation, neuromodulation device that is amazingly effective. It is 80 to 90% effective in treating almost within 2 weeks severe cases of geriatric depression. It's called ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, but it's not the sort of thing you want consumers doing to themselves in their homes.
Right.
So the more powerful you get, the more likely you are to get a result. But things like general anesthesia, not something you should try in your backyard.
Right.
Unless it's with a good red wine.
I have quite a few questions coming in through chat, so I'm going to pause on my side to allow for them to ask a few. So I have Randolph Andrews, who posted a question. Here we go. So hi, Hank. I've been fielding questions about CRISPR and neuroscience. Beyond the obvious science fiction of active gene editing for machine-brain interfacing, are there better questions we should ask?
Well, you know, my last 10 days have been, I've been buried in CRISPR babies. So that's all I've been talking about and been asked about was the twins in China who, at least allegedly, were CRISPR'd. We still don't know whether they actually were or not. But this is the first time anybody's asked me about the neuroscience side of it. I think, well, it depends, which is always the right answer to any good question. For some things, CRISPR might, for some neurological conditions, CRISPR might make a big difference, but they need to be things for which we have good evidence that single genes, or maybe at most 2 genes, have real powerful effects. So if you had an embryo that had 58 CAG repeats in its Huntington gene, and that embryo became a baby, that baby would eventually grow up to be somebody who died of Huntington's disease. That's a neuroscience that's a neuroscience issue. That's a neurodegenerative disease. That's something where CRISPR could make a difference. In terms of the more the things we think about more with respect to neuroscience, things like cognitive enhancement or various abilities, musical ability, math ability. The genetics is just, we're so weak on the genetic side of that. We don't have any really good targets. We don't really know what to do yet. And when we do know something to do, it would probably involve scores, if not hundreds of different genes. So it's something to watch. There will be some applications, particularly not so much for embryos, not so much for CRISPR babies, but for people who've been born who have neurodegenerative disorders, for which there's single genes that play a role. Tay-Sachs disease. If you could use CRISPR as gene therapy for Tay-Sachs disease, which is a terrible neurodegenerative disease which causes babies' brains to basically turn to mush and the babies to die by the age of 3 or 4, if not earlier. That'd be a great advance. But right now, other than trying to fix pathologies, single gene pathologies, I think we're kind of in wait and see with CRISPR in neuroscience. Oh, other than the fact, and it's an amazingly effective research tool.
Right.
I mean, in non-humans, you want to knock out particular genes and see what it does to their cognitive function. CRISPR is perfect for that. You want to insert a human version of a gene into a macaque and see what happens. CRISPR is great for something like that. If you want to take some of there aren't many, but there are a couple of genetic variations that are strongly associated with some forms of autism. It's only about 2 cases of autism in 1,000, so it's not a big source. But if you were to put that into monkeys and see what happened, that could be a great research tool for trying to understand what was happening in people. So research uses in neuroscience, huge. Practical applications at this point, I think, wait and see.
Right. Another question coming in from chat. So how do you feel about how we can balance innovation and regulation with respect to emerging technology and neuroethics?
Yeah. So this is one of those problems, one of those issues that can never be solved, but can only be managed because there are good interests on both sides. And, I think the most honest answer is there's no perfect way to deal with it. You set in different places based on what you perceive as the risks and the benefits. You set the regulatory barriers either high or low. And that changes from culture to culture and application to application and over time. One thing we've seen with the FDA and drugs, over time, FDA will get looser and looser in terms of allowing new drugs in part because of people saying, look, it's allowed in Europe, it's allowed in Japan, why isn't it allowed here? And then something like Vioxx will happen, or Fen-Phen will happen. There'll be some disaster, and then the pendulum will swing all the way back the other direction. And so we see these swings back and forth that are more politically or psychologically induced. I think the right answer for balancing innovation and regulation is going to depends. Well, there's never going to be a right answer, a perfect answer, and the least wrong answer in any particular technology is going to depend enormously on the situation with that particular technology. One size will not fit all.
Right. Another question coming in from chat from Simon Chadzigiannis. I think neuroethics specialist is essential for every neurotech company and serves as a link to all departments. How do you think neuroethics specialists could integrate themselves into the neurotechnology companies of today?
Well, I think they'd love to, and particularly if there are neurotechnology companies that get big enough and well-funded enough to want to hire a neuroethics specialist. I can come up with a list of people who would be happy to do it, either full-time or part-time. I think that many, and I don't think the questioner had this, many science people think of ethicists as people who wear black robes and say, you go to heaven, you go to hell. That it's all about normatively saying this is good or this is bad. But a lot of people in ethics, and I think the vast majority of people in neuroethics, have more the position of how can we do this in the most ethical way?
Right.
Is this ethical at all? And if there are problems with it, how do we make it better? What advice can we give? How can we help? And I know people would love to get involved with neurotech. Many people would love to get involved with technology companies because we want to know what's going on. We want to know what's happening in technology. We want to know where the science is going. Reading the journals can give you some of that information. Talking to neuroscientist friends can give you some of that information. But from consults I've done through a Stanford program with companies involving research ethics questions, I've learned that to get your finger on the pulse, there's nothing as good as being in touch with technology companies and finding out what they care about, what they think, what they want to do, what they think is doable. That's just very deeply enriching to a neuroethicist understanding of how things are going. And I think they can be very helpful in everything from FDA issues to marketing issues to government policy issues to reimbursement issues. Again, this isn't ethics as Aristotle or Kant. This is ethics writ broad, everything about the intersection of science and society. Some of it's ethics, some of it's law, some of it's social issues, some of it's politics with a little p.
Right.
But I think we can be helpful. And a lot of people who do neuroethics would love to engage with companies.
Well, you're seeing a lot of that right now in the field of artificial intelligence, where more of these companies are starting to have to become more transparent on their own practices. And I think it's just going to be a matter of critical mass where the same thing will happen in that.
Yeah, I think that's right, but it's also a matter of critical mass for the companies. Right. A company that's 3 employees on a shoestring isn't likely to have a neuroethicist on the payroll.
Exactly. A question from Eugenie Rudea. On the prediction of diseases, is this a question of setting up laws about privacy? Do you see any problems with prediction as long as people have the ownership of the data and control to who has access to it?
So I'm tempted to say no, none whatsoever, as long as this impossible condition you said is true. People will never have complete control of their data.
Right.
Not only will whoever collected the data have access to the data, they may well share the data with other researchers or other companies. If the police are interested in the data and they get a search warrant or subpoena, they'll share it with the police. They may share it voluntarily with the police. We're already seeing this in the consumer genomics space to some extent. Even if everybody tries to keep it as completely private, which the researchers won't, because both they and NIH want data shared as widely as possible. How many times, so Sydney, how many times have you gotten notices that you've been hacked that your accounts have been hacked in the last couple of years?
Not personally, but there is a service online that allows for you to at least be informed, and I've only received maybe 1 notification in the past couple of years.
I've had my financials hacked from 4 different sources in the last 2 years.
Really?
Yeah, Stanford, Berkeley, the U.S. government, and most recently Marriott. So even if everybody's trying to keep it confidential, it won't be.
Right.
However, to answer the question more fairly, is privacy the only thing we have to worry about with respect to prediction? Privacy could go a long way in helping. If you're worried that you'll lose a job because somebody think you're predicted to have a higher than average chance of getting Alzheimer's disease, say early onset Alzheimer's disease in your 40s or 50s, and you're worried about losing a job, if you have complete protected control over that information, that shouldn't be a problem. If we have good legislation saying employers can't discriminate based on that information, which we do with respect to genetics, but we don't with respect to neuroscience. Right. So actually, let's stick with the Alzheimer's. If an employer learns that you're ApoE4 homozygous, so you've got 2 copies of the number 4 allele of the ApoE gene, your risk of getting Alzheimer's is quite high. They can't discriminate against you because that's genetic information. If you got a PET scan which showed that you have large amounts of amyloid plaque buildup in your brain, and these amyloid PET scans are FDA approved, and somehow your employer found out, they could discriminate because that's not genetic information. So there are issues about discrimination. I think, and the discrimination is not just employers and insurers, but if we could predict which 1% of teenagers would end up being diagnosed with schizophrenia in the next 10 years, would colleges be interested in that? Would medical schools be interested in that? Would police departments interested in hiring officers, or would the military interested in recruiting soldiers be interested in that? Should they be interested in that? Maybe, maybe not. And then, of course, if you do get a bad prediction, what are the effects on the people who care about you? Your spouse, your partner, your parents, yourself. I'd like to think that I'm a resilient person, and more likely when I get some really bad health news, I'll roll with it, but I don't really know. I haven't been in that situation. And so the psychological impacts on the person of prediction, the effects on their relationships with others, their effects in their relations with society, none of this means we shouldn't do it, but it means we should think about it, and individuals, before they get a predictive test, should be asked to stop and think, do they really want to know this or not? And I don't think that happens enough.
So a related question to that, and this might be a little bit out there, maybe in a future society where maybe it's where something like this will be the norm. But with different emerging neuroimaging devices that are coming onto the market, and do you see any potential scenarios where they could be used either as a method to discriminate employees, or could be used in potential legal battles? So to give an example, say we did an MRI or some other form of neuroimaging system to look at the size of your amygdala and try to make some connection that you're at higher risk of impulsive, violent actions. Do you see a potential scenario in the future where this may emerge?
So I think the tools need to get better, because no one is going to surreptitiously do an MRI of you or an fMRI of you. I don't know, Sydney, whether you've ever been in an MRI.
I have.
But there's no way that happens without you knowing what's going on unless you're unconscious.
That's true.
It's a very weird environment, and loud and strange. And apparently they've done MRIs of people who are asleep, and I have no idea how anybody can sleep through that. But some people can. But if we had a way to do it surreptitiously, so think about the last time you went through the airport and you either went through the metal detector or you went through the millimeter scanner.
Right.
What if that could actually detect your mood and whether you were aggressive or not? Do I have a mechanism by which that could happen? Not really. I mean, maybe a really beefed up near-infrared scanning could do something like that, near-infrared laser spectroscopy. Right now, people use it, but it has to be in contact with your head. But maybe you could beef that up. There's a guy named Michel Mahavris at Berkeley who's working on something he calls neurodust. These are nanoparticles. You'd have to get them into your bloodstream, but once you get them into your bloodstream, they'll report back. These are futuristic questions, but they're not crazy questions. Sometimes crazy people ask them, but non-crazy people ask them too. In my colleague and friend and my successor in the International NeuroEthics Society, the president-elect is a law and philosophy professor at Duke named Nita Farahani. And she just did a TED Talk, which was on the front page of the TED homepage when it first went up. It may still be. I think it went up on like November 28th, right, on cognitive liberty. And she talks about how the Constitution doesn't really protect this. It would take new judges with very broad views to make the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. amendment protect what's going on inside our brains. Right now, they're protected because there's no really easy way to do it without you knowing about it. But in the future, that's going to be a real issue. And she points out that already there are companies in China, mainly government-owned, that are requiring workers to wear EEG caps so that they think they can tell. How accurately they can tell, we don't know. But they think they can tell whether the worker is getting drowsy or whether the worker is distracted. And somebody will be monitoring it and will call the foreman and say, take He Jiankui off the line because he's distracted. And maybe it's not all bad. Take Hank Greeley, who's driving a school bus, off the school bus because he's falling asleep. But those kinds of invasions to our privacy, if they come through an employer, I don't think we've got any real protection against that right now in the US. And certainly if you're in the military, that's not exactly an employer-employee relationship, but you don't have a lot of protection there either.
Right. Another question coming in from chat from Vanessa Mara. If government and businesses can finally control people's minds, so maybe we're thinking in a future where neuromodulation is very easy to be done and without your actual awareness of it,
right.
Do you think hacking our own brain will be necessary for our freedom?
So in that world, maybe tinfoil hats or something more effective. My hope is it'll never get to that. But look, if you want to try to change somebody's brain so they're not OCD, or so they're not bipolar, or not schizophrenic, what you learn about changing their brains in those ways may also help you change their brains in other ways. Cochlear implants, wonderful technology for treating deafness. You actually hear without sound waves affecting your ears. There's a microphone that picks up things, turns them, a computer that then turns them into a pattern for a chip right next to your cochlear nerve to stimulate the cochlear nerve, and you hear things.
Right.
And right now people use that to hear their spouses or dinner conversations or lectures or so on. Well, if you have a cochlear implant and somebody hacked into it, they could make you hear voices that weren't there.
Right.
That sort of stuff is worrisome. Whether hacking yourself would actually be a protection or not, I don't know. Happily, I think we've got, that may never become possible, but it might. And I think we need to start, it's not too early to start thinking about it. And again, I'm plugging my friend Nita's TED Talk on cognitive liberty and the book that she needs to finish on cognitive liberty, because she's got some thoughts about how we might have legal protections against that. It is still science fiction, but it may not be science fiction for a lot longer. But I even hate to say this, because the worst part of my job as somebody who works in law and neuroscience and neuroethics, probably over the last 10 years, at least once a month, I've gotten an email or a phone call or a letter, or a couple of times people knocking on my office door who want my help to get the chip out of their brain that's controlling them.
Wow.
Or to stop the microwave transmissions that are controlling them.
Wow.
These people, I believe, are delusional. I don't think this is happening.
Right.
But one thing I've learned both from them and from some experience with some mentally ill family members is you can't talk people out of their delusions.
Right.
So I said, at first I would say, get me an MR that shows that there's a chip in your brain, and I promise I will help you get it out. And they say, well, no, these are special chips. They don't show up on MR. Well, give me a CT scan. No, they don't show up on CT scans either. It's really, really sad because there's nothing you can do to help them. Initially, I tried to help people, and I think I just made things worse. And then at some point, when you can't help them, they decide you're part of the conspiracy. And yet, this is delusions are very dependent on culture and era. And in our era right now, this is not uncommon delusion. There's even an organization of folks who call themselves targeted individuals who believe this is happening to them. And even talking about mind control as something that might be possible in the future, one possible negative effect of this webinar is that maybe somebody who's on the edge of a delusion will hear this and decide, yeah, his brain really is being controlled by the Trilateral Commission or the stone cutters or whatever.
Right. Maybe an extended question and perhaps a controversial one to follow up with the story you just shared. With people that seem to have these delusions and this paranoia that they're being watched and there's chips being implanted in your brain. If there was a potential scenario where either TMS or some other form of neuromodulation technique can be used to help and minimize those delusions, do you think that this is ethically okay to do?
Yeah, that is that is not a new question.
Right.
Ever since there have been effective antipsychotic drugs, not perfectly effective, but somewhat effective antipsychotic drugs, starting with Thorazine back in the early 50s, people have asked, should you be able to do this to somebody who doesn't consent? And at its worst, in the 50s and 60s, that led to lots of mandatory overdrugging, overcommitment, lobotomies, overuse of early primitive, strong side effects, electroconvulsive therapy. That was a horror show. On the other hand, do you really want to let somebody who's not thinking rationally continue to make decisions that will harm herself and others? And that's the difficult line we're in. Our general political principles, legal principles in the US are that competent adults should be able to do pretty much anything they want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. But when you're dealing with adults who aren't competent, who you think are not making rational, well-conceived decisions, when do you step in to commit them? Every state has an involuntary commitment procedure. Usually you can commit somebody for a 72-hour hold based on evidence, even without going to a judge for 72 hours, that they're a danger to themselves or others. That's an invasion of those people's liberty. Is it a justified invasion? That line is always a hard one. We know at one extreme it won't be. In the old Soviet Union, they used to take political dissidents and put them in mental facilities and overdrug them and treat them, because you'd have to be insane not to love the workers' paradise. The system is so wonderful that the only people who can be dissidents have to be crazy. That was wrong. How far should we go? My hope is that ultimately we'll have sufficiently better treatments that people will want to get treated. Right now, one of the problems with a lot of the treatments is they just don't work very well.
Right.
So I want to stress that for a second. There are a lot of issues in neuroethics, and we tend to worry about the bad stuff because it's more interesting. It gets more attention. It interests those of us who work and write on these things more. But there's some other ethical issues too. I think serious neuroscience research is an ethical imperative because hundreds of millions, and in fact, when you count friends and relatives, billions of people around the world are suffering terribly from mental illness and neurological disease. Hundreds of millions of people directly have the disease, and their loved ones suffer from the disease with them, because of them, on their behalf. And we've made very little progress in the last 20 or 30 years. And there's a little bit of advance with cognitive behavioral therapy in some areas, but new drugs for mental illness have been unsuccessful. Multiple sclerosis and neurological disease we've done okay with, but new drugs for, say, breakthroughs in Alzheimer's and other dementias, nothing. So I think there's an ethical imperative founded on the need to relieve human suffering to do serious neuroethics, neuroscience research. And that's one of the reasons to try to help people. I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of neuroethics people view their job as trying to help researchers and companies do things in a good way, do good things in a good way, because God knows there's a lot of good stuff that needs to be done.
Right. So we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up here. So maybe we can talk a little bit about neural enhancement, and more particularly in terms of its use in, say, in professional gaming or in professional sports. So if we use the example of TDCS, going back to that once again, and what it was being used for in because I know there was I think a few teams that were part of the Tour de France that were actually using it. Then I know there's an increased amount of use with that in football, and even just with standard like neurofeedback devices. They become very, very popular in a lot of professional sports environments. Do you think that it's fair to be using something like this? Do you just see this as a natural, evolution of the sport itself, or does it, similar to standard doping? Is this just the equivalent to neural doping?
So that's a complicated question that would be a lot harder for me to deal with if I believed that any of these actually work very well. Caffeine works pretty well for most people for a while. Adderall and Ritalin help people who have ADD and ADHD. Not entirely clear that they do anything cognitively for normal people other than keep them awake, which is kind of a cognitive enhancer. If you've got to write a paper and it's the middle of the night, being awake is a good thing. Modafinil helps people stay awake. Does it enhance cognitive skills? And this is another one of those areas where the research, the first things that get published say, yeah, Adderall and Ritalin help normal people do better cognitively. And then the next studies and the next studies and the next studies are all a downward trend. The way I read the literature at this point, it's unclear whether there's any effect. My friend Martha Farah at Penn did a nice study, a blinded study, double-blinded study of Ritalin. And she gave people Ritalin or a placebo that tasted and sort of felt like Ritalin somehow, and gave them a bunch of cognitive tests, and found that on none of the cognitive tests was there a statistically significant difference between the people who got the drug and the people who got the placebo. Right. On one question, there was a significant difference. Do you feel that you're enhanced? And the people who were getting the Ritalin statistically significantly and substantially were more likely to feel that they were enhanced. Right. So I don't know that any of this works right now. Except that, of course, there's a great baseball movie from, 25 years ago, Bull Durham.
Right.
And at some point, the catcher has the rookie pitcher wearing garters. No, the girlfriend, the groupie.
Yeah, I remember that thing.
Has the pitcher wearing garters. And, the answer is, if you think wearing garters makes you a better pitcher, wearing garters makes you a better pitcher. And to some extent, through confidence in the placebo effect, maybe they all work, but maybe so does carrying a rabbit's foot or wearing garters. However, if we do get good cognitive enhancement, a good night's sleep, that's a great cognitive enhancer. But if we get really substantial beyond our current range cognitive enhancement, then it does open up a lot of hard questions, and not just in sports, but in things like medical school. So to become an American doctor, you need to do well in organic chemistry, even though I've known very, very few practicing doctors who needed to know organic chemistry to treat patients. But you got to pass organic chemistry, and it helps to get a good grade. If, in fact, there were a drug that would help people pass organic chemistry, do well in organic chemistry, should we drug test before all final exams? Should we have two sections, the drug section and the non-drug section, and curve them differently? There will be real questions if we get to real cognitive enhancement. Right now, and I wrote about this, the paper I got that got the most comments ever was a piece in Nature in 2008 on cognitive enhancement. And at that point, 10 years ago, actually it was December 2008, so exactly 10 years ago, I thought that in 10 years there would actually be something pretty useful. We're 10 years on and I'm not seeing it. So maybe in another 10 years, maybe not. But when we do, these will raise questions. I've actually given some thought to what the answers to those questions should be, and it's complicated. There are fairness issues, there are coercion issues, there are safety issues, but I don't know that they're showstoppers entirely, particularly when you deal with sports, because athletes are enhanced in almost every conceivable way.
Right.
Their training, to their equipment, to sports psychologists, to their diet, to their weightlifting. Why is a drug different from other enhancement? Why is TDCS different from other enhancement? My favorite example of this is endurance running, endurance sports. where having more hemoglobin is a plus. It is against the rules and can get you banned if you inject yourself with EPO to increase your hemoglobin. It is against the rules and can get you banned if you transfuse yourself with red blood cells to give yourself more hemoglobin. It is against the rules and can get you banned. No, it's not against the rules if you go off and train at high altitude where your body naturally makes more hemoglobin. And it's not against the rules if you work at low altitude, but you sleep in a tent that has a low oxygen concentration.
Right.
So you make more hemoglobin. Does that make any sense? And I think if and when we get to cognitive enhancement, we're going to have to deal with a whole bunch of questions, happily or unhappily. As I get older, I find names disappear more. I hope none of my students is listening to this. I remember their names during the term, but 2 weeks later, I can remember it's John or Joe or Josh, and I can remember where he sat. I can remember what grade I gave him, but I can't remember his name anymore. If there were a pill I could take that could give me that back, I'd take that in a second, in a nanosecond. But unfortunately, there's not, as far as I know.
Right. So maybe just as a closing question, where would you recommend people, if they're interested in learning more about neuroethics, to go? What books would you recommend for them to look at?
Well, first, I'd recommend that they join the International NeuroEthics Society. We're cheap, and we're a good source of information. Just Google International NeuroEthics Society, and you'll find us. I don't really have a classic go-to book. There are a number of compilations of edited books with chapters from various people. A couple from Oxford University Press, Barbara Sahakian and Judy Illes have done a couple of them. Mike Gazzaniga, a famous neuroscientist, has a book that from about 10 years ago, and I can't remember now what it's called, that deals with some of these issues. Be happy to send people PDFs of a couple of my articles that I think deal with some of these. I'm hgreeley at stanford.edu. I promise to think about trying to respond to any emails that I get, but I wish I did, but I don't really have a go-to reference on it. Well, other than the International NeuroEthics Society, which welcomes you all with open arms.
So for the people listening, go check out the website. They do have some fantastic resources over there, and I would adamantly tell you to all check it out. They could also reach out to you via Twitter as well?
Yes. I tweet way too much. And for Twitter, I'm Hank Greeley, LSJU, which Leland Stanford Junior University, because somebody else who's never tweeted and never followed anybody has Hank Greeley. I can't figure out who it is.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Greeley, for joining us today. And thank you for everyone for listening in. The webinar should be up on our channel if you missed parts of it and you came in a little bit late. But with that, thank you for everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Take care.
Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun, Sydney.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.